So this is an example of planetary changes of the third kind, inadvertent changes, but it's also the example I want to introduce now to introduce planetary changes of the fourth kind, which I call intentional global changes, which is when a species acting globally recognizes a global threat and changes their behavior in order to mitigate it. And so the ozone hole is a great example of that. It's a success story. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to always be easy to solve these problems. There are some ways in which that's a much easier problem to solve than, say, the climate change problem we're confronting now. But it's a proof of concept. It shows that we have it within us to respond in a different and more constructive way globally to a global threat. So as that, I think it's a very important example. Now let's look at some other potential examples of intentional changes, of planetary changes of the fourth kind. So in the upper left, we have, as already mentioned, the success story, the ozone hole. And in the upper right, this is the climate challenge, the challenge that we're confronted with now, that we need to change our energy sources globally to systems that do not threaten to destroy the natural systems upon which we depend to live. And the good news is that this change is happening. Solar and wind are getting cheaper. Emission curves are starting to bend. It's clearly happening. 100 years from now, we'll look back on this time and we'll say, well, it's a good thing we got off fossil fuels. And we'll say, we sure took too long to do that. Look at the damage we did that we could have avoided. It'll be a little bit like today we look at using whale oil and say, wow, we hunted whales for far too long. Look at the damage we did. We didn't need to use whale oil. We could have switched earlier, but at least they're still whales. We didn't destroy all of them. And I believe that 100 years from now, we'll be still here and we'll be repairing the damage from climate change. So it is a change that's happening. So it belongs in this intentional category. It's just painfully, slowly that it's happening. Now, what about these two images on the bottom? These are meant to represent future threats that will also require intentional planetary responses. On the bottom left is the impact threat. The planet has been hit before by large impacts like the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Left to its own devices, it would be hit again. And there will, if we wait long enough, there will be dangerous asteroid impacts that can wipe out population centers, or at the really large ones could cause another mass extinction. But the good news is we know how to stop this now. We just had this mission DART, the double asteroid redirect test, where we gave an asteroid a little push to sort of practice. And if a big asteroid was coming our way, I believe we would be able to mitigate that danger now and give it a little push. So this is a new ability that our planet has, that in its 4 billion year lifetime of getting hit by dangerous objects from space, it's never had before. Now our planet can defend itself. So this is an example of an intentional response to a global threat, where something we're just beginning to have the capability of doing. Now, you know, why should we worry about these long-term threats? Why do these belong in the same discussion? Well, I believe if we're going to start seeing ourselves as a geological force, which is what we are, then we need to start thinking on long time scales, on geological time scales. And the fact is, if we're aware of a threat and we know how to mitigate it, how to save not just humans, but other creatures from this threat, then I believe that gives us a responsibility, gives us a moral duty to act on that knowledge. So we're learning new things about the universe, including threats to our future existence, and we're gaining the ability and the responsibility to mitigate them. Now, on the lower right, this is meant to represent natural climate change. If we wait long enough, there will be dangerous climate change that we will probably want to mitigate. You know, we tend to think of climate change as something that just humans are causing, and that without us, the world would be this paradise for life and everything would be fine. But that's an illusion, because humans, our entire civilizations have been built up in this last 10,000 years in this very unusual time of Earth history of relatively stable and warm climate, which absolutely will not last. If we wait another 50,000 years, there would be another ice age, and our civilization would not survive it. The last one, North America, was buried under a mile of ice. Many billions of humans would die, not to mention extinctions of other species. But we've got a while to work that one out. And the good news is clearly we do know how to change Earth's climate. And if we can just develop ways to do that subtly and intentionally and non-destructively, then these are threats that will no longer cause mass extinctions on Earth. So obviously, our most immediate challenge is to stop the climate vandalism we are currently causing on the planet. But it is my view that this larger view of what it means to become an intentional actor on the planet and the other responsibilities in the long run that gives us can help us kind of get a handle on ourselves and realize the ways that we need to think and need to act. So now, thinking again about Earth history, we can ask, what is the Anthropocene going to be in Earth history? Is it just an event, something that happened for a little while and then we blew it? So there'll be this brief little layer of, Twinkie wrappers and iPhones and things, and then then we'll be gone, and the world will go on as it was? Is it more of an epoch, like some of the Paleocene or some of these other historical epochs that'll last for tens of millions of years and then will be over? Or is it something that will never be over because we're changing the planet in some kind of permanent way? Could it be a planetary transition, like the origin of life or the Cambrian explosion? Is there some way that we can become great, our actions, the actions of technological intelligent life forms, can become gracefully integrated into the functioning of the planet in a sustainable way that really then becomes a new phase of Earth history? It's another way of asking, is human style intelligence adaptive or self-limiting? In other words, these new skills that we bring to the table of technology and changing the planet and language and culture and all that, is that something that has to wipe itself out? Or is there a way that it can actually lead to great longevity? Well, when we think of the long-term future, as an astrobiologist, I always start to think about SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Because when we do the math of SETI, what we realize is that if there's anybody else out there to talk to, they're going to be the ones that have survived this transition that we're going through now and have learned to live for a long time with technology. Because any civilization that's a flash in the pan that only lasts for 100 or 1,000 years before wiping themselves out is not one you're going to be able to ever communicate or talk to. The math of SETI says that the civilizations that you can talk to at interstellar distances are the ones that have lasted for a long time, for many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So they've gone through some kind of transition that we are struggling to go through. And that makes me think of, what is the goal here? It's worthwhile to talk about what we're trying to avoid in the near term. Obviously, we're trying to avoid dangerous climate change, but what are we trying to create? We have to think of the world we want to inhabit, the world we want to create, not just the threats we want to avoid. Where are we trying to go? And when I move on to that topic, I have this phrase that I use, and I used it in the title of this talk, and I talk about it in my book, Earth in Human Hands, and that is Terra Sapiens, which means wise Earth. And that is the vision of a planet where our activities have become well integrated into the cyclic behavior of Earth. Instead of fighting against the Earth, we've learned enough about ourselves and about the planet to work with the planet long term. That's what I mean by Terra Sapiens. And it's clear from that perspective that in order for our civilization to survive, that we need to become a new kind of entity on this planet, one that can learn to live comfortably over the long haul with world-changing technology. And to me, I think it's a change we're just beginning to undertake. And when I give talks about this, sometimes I'm confronted with people who say, oh, well, that'll never happen because it's not human nature. And I think that sometimes people are under illusions about, quote, human nature, about what's really immutable about humans. But if you look at the long-term history of our species, you see that we've gone through many major changes in the way we interact with each other and in the way we interact with the natural world in response to survival threats. For instance, there's a place on the south coast of Africa, near the southern tip of Africa in South Africa, called Pinnacle Point. It's an archaeological site where archaeologists and anthropologists think that they've identified possibly the location where modern humanity was born, where the first modern humans were born. And that's debatable. It's not certain, but it's a candidate for that. And the reason why is because at this location in Pinnacle Point, humans had to learn to survive in a new way. This is a time about 190,000 years ago when our species was almost completely wiped out, when our forebears were almost completely wiped out. Why? Because of climate change. There was an ice age in Africa. Much of Africa was covered with ice, and therefore the game, we were hunter-gatherers up to that point, but the game died out. There was nobody to hunt, and a small band of humans, probably less than 1,000 maybe survivors, that then repopulated all of us, retreated to this coastal area in Pinnacle Point, and they learned to live in new ways, and they relied largely on coastal resources, shellfish and so forth. But in order to do so, they had to invent new kinds of technology. And this is where we think the origin of what we call long chain complex recipe technology came from. And when I say long chain complex recipe technology, that phrase means you're making something from which the products are not obvious from the nature of the ingredients. It's somebody needs to teach you how to go through a complex set of transformations to get to the end product. You know, we're always hearing about some indigenous people who have some drug or some food, but in order for it not to be poison, they have to take this plant and they have to boil it and refine it and do this and this other thing, or else it won't work. And you always think like, well, how did they figure out how to do that? That's long chain complex recipe technology. And the point here is that in order to do that, they had to invent more complex language and more complex cooperation, not just between individuals, but between generations. And this is also, by the way, the site where a lot of new like body adornment and art is found. And clearly, the need to survive in this new way and develop this complex technology and communicate it and pass it on to future generations led humans to enlarge their circle of cooperation, cooperate more between generations, and embed their technological solutions to how to survive in the world in an expanding social circle of interaction and mutual care and mutual communication. So this is a place where we fundamentally, we were faced with extinction, and we learned to survive by enlarging our circles of cooperation and communicating in new ways. And in a way, I think those are the kinds of challenges we're faced with today. And sometimes when people ask me, well, so this is fine, Terra Sapiens, but what would it look like in detail? And one response I have to that is, it's very hard to say in detail, but can you imagine if you could talk to the people of Pinnacle Point? Could you imagine trying to describe to them a modern city and all the systems we have to survive, all the things we take for granted that work so well, sewage systems and transportation systems and electricity systems and all these marvelous cooperative systems that we survive on? Could you imagine trying to describe a modern city to the people of Pinnacle Point? You couldn't do it. And maybe it's just as hard for us to envision the details of what Terra Sapiens would look like. So I can't describe it to you in detail, but I can tell you some of its properties because they're defined by the need for our technological innovations to fit within the global functioning of the planet that we're learning more and more about all the time, and not exceed any of the operating limits of our planet. And one last point I would like to make is about the metaphors we use when we're describing ourselves and thinking about our future. We often use these very negative metaphors. We talk about we're a cancer on the planet, we're a virus, we're criminals, you know, we're raping the rainforest, all these negative images of disease and criminality. And, you know, there's some truth to these metaphors. If you look at our long-term growth patterns, it is sort of like a cancer. And yes, we have committed some crimes against the biosphere, but it's also true that there are ways in which these metaphors, I think, are wrong and do not serve us, because a virus never gets together with other viruses and says, well, look at our behavior. Look at what we've done. Maybe we shouldn't be a virus. Maybe we shouldn't be a cancer. And while we are guilty of inadvertently doing some really destructive things to the biosphere and causing some extinctions, we're also the only species that ever has attempted not to cause extinctions and attempted to revive endangered species. No other species has that kind of equipment. So we've got some potential also to reverse these behaviors. And I worry that if we describe ourselves according to these metaphors, then we almost lock in that perception of ourselves, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So other kinds of metaphors I've advocated are those of childhood, where really what we're trying to do here on the planet, nobody has ever tried to do before. We're realizing that we are a species changing the planet, and we're really quite young at this. We're babies and we don't know how to do it, and there are no adults that can teach us. We're like abandoned orphans that need to learn how to do it ourselves. And in the middle here, the metaphor of the unschooled driver. You know, if you think of the role we have taken on the planet, we're kind of at the wheel, but we don't know how to drive. We're like a child that's like suddenly finds itself at the wheel of a big rig, and, you know, everything and everybody we love, by the way, is in the back, and we're barreling down this road and we're going, hey, I don't know how to drive this thing. That's the role that we're really in on this planet. And rather than berate ourselves and say, oh, humans are so awful, we should just disappear, I think we can realize that we're young and immature, and we need to grow up in a hurry because we've taken on this responsibility, and we can look at ourselves with a little bit more sympathy and hope for the future. And on the right over here, that zombie-ish creature, that's meant to symbolize the metaphor of the sleepwalker. In a way, it's almost like we're waking up and going, whoa, look at us on this planet. Look at this role we have. How did we get here? We didn't ask for this. And that sense of suddenly finding ourselves in this role that we don't really know how to undertake, of having, whether we like it or not, some responsibility for how our planet operates and for its future. It's daunting, but I feel like if we use these metaphors, we have a little bit more sympathy for ourselves and can realize that the task in front of us is not to sort of stop trying to change the planet, because, with 8 billion people on this planet now, we don't have that option. We need a high-tech civilization, unless you want mass starvation, which nobody wants. So the challenge is to learn how to, to be better drivers, to have a graceful interaction between our technological civilization and the natural systems which surround us, and integrate well within those systems. That's really how we create Terra Sapiens. So in conclusion, I just want to end with a quote from one of my heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, if we are to have peace on Earth, which I also interpret as if we are to create a sustainable global civilization, then our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional, must transcend race, tribe, class, and nations. And this means we must develop a world perspective. And I think I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.